There is a version of World War I that most people carry with them without ever examining it too closely. It involves mud and courage and a kind of noble suffering. Men who went over the top with their chins raised, who endured the unendurable and came home changed but not broken, who remembered their fallen comrades with quiet dignity and went on to build the world we inherited. That version is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in ways that matter enormously, and the parts that have been left out are not peripheral details. They are the central experience of the war for the men who actually lived inside it. The truth of World War I is not a story of heroism suppressed by modesty. It is a story of institutional machinery so large and so indifferent that the human beings inside it ceased to be people in any meaningful administrative sense and became instead units of labor, units of firepower, units of loss. The paperwork was meticulous, the suffering was standardized, and the men who endured it were expected by every system they answered to treat their own destruction as a professional obligation. What follows is an account of what those men actually learned to live with. Not the broad strokes of military history, not the named battles and their casualty figures rendered as statistics, but the specific, daily, physical and psychological realities that accumulated over months and years until they became the texture of existence itself. These were not exceptional experiences. They were routine. That is precisely what makes them worth understanding. The first thing a soldier learned, usually within his first week at the front, was that the smell never left. This is not a poetic observation. It is a physiological fact that veterans return to again and again in letters, in memoirs, in medical testimony, and in the private conversations that historians have only partially reconstructed. The Western Front had a smell that was entirely its own, a compound of decomposing flesh and waterlogged soil and cordite residue and chloride of lime, which was the disinfectant used in latrines and on corpses, and wet wool and unwashed bodies, and the particular acrid sweetness of mustard gas residue on contaminated ground. Men described it in letters home, and then stopped describing it because there were no adequate words, and because they did not want their families to understand what they were breathing every day. The smell was not a background condition. It was constant, and it was specific, and it changed in ways that soldiers learned to read. A fresh wind from certain directions meant the bodies on the far side of the wire had shifted or swollen. A particular sweetness in the morning air meant that a gas attack had been recent and that the ground was still contaminated. The smell of a specific sector told experienced men things about the state of the front that no briefing could communicate as efficiently. They learned to live inside that smell for weeks and months at a time, and when they came home on leave, the smell came with them in their clothing and their hair, and in some way that they could not articulate, in their skin. Wives and mothers noticed it without knowing what it was. The men themselves often could not smell it anymore. That was the adaptation. The olfactory system habituated to what the conscious mind would have found unbearable, and the men who came home smelling of the front were, in a very specific neurological sense, already somewhere else. The second reality was the rats. The accounts of rats in the trenches have become so familiar that they have lost their power to disturb, which is itself a kind of loss. But the rats of the Western Front were not a colorful detail of trench life. They were a daily presence that forced soldiers into a relationship with their own physical vulnerability that civilian life had not prepared them for in any way. The rats were larger than most men expected, fed as they were on a diet that included human remains. They moved through the trenches at night in numbers that witnesses struggled to estimate. They nested in the walls of dugouts. They ran across sleeping men. They ate the food stored in any container that was not sealed with metal. They gnawed leather equipment and the paper of letters, and when the opportunity presented itself, the flesh of the dead, and the flesh of the wounded who could not protect themselves. Soldiers killed rats constantly. It was one of the few activities that required no permission and produced no paperwork, and gave men a direct, physical outlet for aggression in an environment where aggression was otherwise entirely controlled by command structure. They killed rats with bayonets and with entrenching tools and with improvised traps, and sometimes with their bare hands. The killing had no effect on the population. The rats were a consequence of the conditions, and the conditions did not change, so the rats did not diminish. Men made peace with the rats, not emotionally, but practically. They stopped being surprised by them. They stopped flinching when one ran across their chest in the dark. This habituation was not resilience in any meaningful psychological sense. It was a narrowing of the threshold of what the nervous system registered as a threat, a recalibration downward that happened so gradually the men rarely noticed it was happening. The third reality was the lice. Every soldier on the Western Front, without exception that any honest account records, was infested with lice within a short time of arriving at the front. This was not a failure of hygiene in any individual sense. The conditions of trench warfare made delousing effectively impossible for extended periods. Men wore the same clothing for weeks. Washing facilities were unavailable for days and sometimes weeks at a time. The lice spread through every piece of fabric, nesting in the seams of shirts and trousers where the heat of the body was most consistent, and they fed continuously. The biting was constant. Men scratched until they bled. They spent hours in quiet moments running their thumbnails along the seams of their clothing, crushing lice between thumbnail and fabric, a process called chatting, because soldiers did it in groups and talked while they worked. The eggs were embedded too deeply in the fabric to be removed this way, and within days the population restored itself. The lice also carried trench fever, a bacterial infection transmitted through louse feces, entering skin abrasions from scratching, which caused recurring fevers and severe pain and incapacitated hundreds of thousands of men over the course of the war. The connection between lice and trench fever was not established until 1918, which meant that for most of the war, the men were being treated for a disease whose cause was literally on their bodies and in their clothing every day, and no one in any position of medical authority was making that connection with enough urgency to change the outcome. The fourth thing soldiers learned to live with was the mud. The mud of the Western Front has been written about extensively, but it is worth being precise about what that mud actually was, because imprecision allows it to remain a symbol rather than a physical reality. The mud of the Ypres salient in particular, and of Passchendaele specifically, was not ordinary wet soil. The ground of Flanders had a clay subsoil that became, when saturated with water and churned by artillery shells over a period of months and years, a substance with the consistency of thick paste that could and did swallow men whole. The drainage systems that had kept the Flemish lowlands cultivable for centuries were destroyed in the first months of war and never repaired. The result was a landscape in which water had nowhere to go, and the topsoil was turned by bombardment into a fluid medium that behaved in ways that ordinary mud does not. It pulled at boots. It filled shell craters to a depth of several feet, and shell craters were everywhere, covering the entire surface of the ground, in some sectors so completely that there was no solid footing anywhere within sight. Men fell into shell craters filled with this liquid mud and drowned. They drowned in mud. This was not a rare event. It was documented in sufficient numbers that medical officers and military commanders were aware of it as a cause of death that required no enemy action whatsoever. Men were swallowed by the ground they were fighting to hold, and the war continued around them and after them without pause. Soldiers in these conditions developed trench foot, a condition resulting from prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions in which the feet, unable to dry, began to deteriorate. The blood flow to the extremities reduced. The tissues broke down. In advanced cases, which were common, the flesh of the foot became gangrenous and the foot required amputation. The army issued orders about foot inspection and the application of whale oil to the feet to provide some barrier against moisture, and NCOs were responsible for ensuring that men in their section attended to their feet daily. This was an attempt to address a medical condition through bureaucratic compliance, and it worked imperfectly at best, because the conditions that caused trench foot were the conditions of the trench itself, which could not be changed by any amount of administrative attention. Men lost their feet. They lost their toes. They spent months in hospital wards recovering from a condition that was entirely a product of where they had been ordered to stand. The fifth reality was the noise. Artillery bombardment at the scale practiced on the Western Front produced noise levels that had no precedent in human experience before the industrial age, and the human auditory system was not designed for sustained exposure to them. A heavy artillery bombardment could last for days. The preparatory bombardment before the Battle of the Somme lasted 7 days and fired over 1.5 million shells. The noise was not merely loud. It was physically percussive. It moved through the body. Men in trenches during heavy bombardment described the experience as being inside the sound rather than hearing it from outside, a sensation of total immersion in destructive force that was as much physical as auditory. The ground shook continuously. The walls of dugouts cracked and shed dirt. Men pressed themselves into the earth and waited. The sustained exposure to this noise had neurological consequences that the medical establishment of the time was almost entirely unequipped to understand or treat. Shell shock, as it came to be called, was not fully understood as a neurological condition during the war itself. The symptoms presented in wildly varying forms. Some men lost the ability to speak. Some lost the ability to walk without tremor. Some experienced violent nightmares that continued indefinitely after their removal from the front. Some exhibited what appeared to be paralysis without any physiological cause. Some became aggressive and uncontrollable. Some became entirely passive, unresponsive, blank. The military response to these presentations was deeply inconsistent and frequently punitive. Men who could not function were sometimes classified as cowards. Executions were carried out on men who were, by any modern diagnostic standard, suffering from severe neurological trauma. The number of men executed by the British Army for desertion or cowardice during World War I, many of whom almost certainly were suffering from psychological conditions that made voluntary behavior essentially impossible, was 306. These executions were carried out by firing squad, composed in many cases of men from the condemned soldier's own unit, who were ordered to kill their colleague as a disciplinary measure and who then returned to the trenches. The sixth reality was the specific and particular experience of living alongside the dead. On the Western Front, the dead were not removed from the battlefield in any systematic way. The conditions that made fighting possible also made recovery of bodies frequently impossible, and the sheer numbers involved overwhelmed any retrieval system that could have been put in place. In sectors where fighting had been heavy, the walls of the trenches were themselves composed partly of human remains. Men dug into the earth and found bodies. They repaired damaged trench walls using whatever material was at hand, and sometimes what was at hand was not soil and sandbags, but the compacted remains of men who had died in previous engagements and had been absorbed into the landscape. Soldiers ate their rations within feet of human decomposition. They slept beside it. They used corpses as landmarks in communication systems and as reference points in tactical planning. A specific body in a specific location became a navigational tool, referred to by soldiers without any particular emotional register, because emotional registers required energy that was needed elsewhere. The smell of decomposing human flesh is chemically specific and distinctly recognizable, and soldiers at the front were exposed to it so consistently that many reported losing the ability to identify it as a distinct odor. It became part of the general smell of the front, indistinguishable from the other components of that compound. Men who left the front for periods of leave and then returned described the smell reasserting itself immediately, not as a shock but as a recognition, like returning to a place that had been waiting for them. The seventh thing soldiers had to accommodate was the collapse of time. The rhythms by which civilian life is organized, the divisions of day and night into work and rest, the punctuation of the week by different activities, the sense of time moving towards something, all of these were distorted or destroyed in the trenches. Work at the front was performed primarily at night because daylight movement above the parapet was immediately lethal. Men spent the daylight hours in the trench, unable to move freely, unable to see the horizon, unable to do anything that required exposure. Night brought working parties, carrying parties, repair of wire and trench wall, patrols into no man's land, the full range of physical labor that maintained the front's function. Then daylight came, and the confinement resumed. This inversion of the normal relationship between light and activity had physiological consequences. Sleep deprivation was chronic and severe. Men slept in fragments, in positions that were not restful, in conditions that did not permit the sleep depth the body required. The accumulation of sleep debt over weeks and months of frontline service produced cognitive impairment that affected judgment, reaction time, emotional regulation, and the capacity for abstract reasoning, none of which were recognized by military medicine as relevant factors in assessing a man's fitness for duty. The eighth reality was the food. British Army rations on the Western Front were theoretically adequate in caloric terms, and the logistics of supplying millions of men across a front of hundreds of miles was genuinely complex in ways that deserve acknowledgement. But the experience of food at the front was not theoretical. It was physical and immediate and consistently degraded by the conditions in which it was consumed and distributed. Hot food was cold by the time it reached the front line, carried in containers through communication trenches that could take hours to traverse. Biscuits were famously hard, not as a quality description but as a physical property, hard enough that men with dental problems, which was most men, could not eat them without soaking them first. Bully beef, the canned corned beef that was the staple protein, was consumed cold and without variety until the smell and taste of it became associated, for many men, with a profound and involuntary aversion. Water was available primarily as a chemical experience. The water supply at the front was treated with chemicals to make it safe to drink and transported in petrol cans that had not always been thoroughly cleaned, giving it a taste that men described as simultaneously medicinal and petrochemical. The ninth reality was the specific terror of gas. Chemical warfare on the Western Front began in April 1915 with the German use of chlorine at Ypres, and it did not stop. It evolved. The gases used became more sophisticated, more difficult to detect, more difficult to treat, and more psychologically devastating. Chlorine was visible as a greenish cloud and smelled strongly enough that men could detect it and respond. Phosgene was less visible, and its smell, faintly of freshly cut hay, was subtle enough that men sometimes did not identify it until they had already received a damaging dose. Mustard gas was not primarily a lethal agent in the way that chlorine or phosgene was. It was a persistent blister agent designed not to kill, but to incapacitate, to keep men off the battlefield and in hospitals for weeks, consuming medical resources and manpower. It settled on surfaces and remained active for days, contaminating ground, equipment, and clothing. Men who walked through mustard-contaminated areas hours after the initial attack were still exposed. It blistered the skin, the eyes, the mucous membranes of the nose and throat and lungs. Men who received heavy doses spent weeks in hospitals, with their eyes bandaged, unable to see, in severe pain from blistering across their entire bodies, uncertain whether their sight would return. The gas mask was the soldiers' primary defense against chemical attack, and every man on the Western Front was issued one and trained to put it on within a prescribed number of seconds. Drills were conducted, compliance was enforced. But the gas mask itself was not a comfortable or neutral piece of equipment. Wearing it for extended periods produced heat buildup, fogging of the eyepieces, difficulty breathing under the resistance of the filter, and a claustrophobic sensation that many men found acutely distressing. Men who had already been exposed to gas once showed elevated anxiety responses to the mask itself because the mask was associated with threat rather than safety in the way their nervous systems had been trained to associate things. Gas alarms were sometimes false. Men put on their masks in the dark and the chaos of a bombardment and wore them for hours in conditions that were already physically extreme, and sometimes there had been no gas at all, and they had worn the masks for nothing, except that they could not have known that. The uncertainty was itself a form of chronic stress. Gas might come at any time. It was invisible in many of its forms. It could travel on the wind from directions that made no tactical sense. The soldier's relationship to the air around him was permanently changed by chemical warfare in ways that no debrief or training exercise had prepared him for. The 10th reality was the particular bureaucratic nature of death at the front. Death in World War I was processed. It moved through administrative systems. When a man died, his personal effects were collected and inventoried. A form was completed. A letter was sent to his next of kin. The letter followed a template. It expressed regret and noted that the deceased had died in service to his country. It frequently did not describe the manner of death, because the manner of death was frequently not the kind of information that templates were designed to convey. If a shell had landed in a dugout and removed a man entirely, leaving nothing identifiable, the letter still went out saying that he had died and that his comrades remembered him. The inventory of personal effects was completed even when there were no personal effects to inventory, because there was nothing left of the man himself. The form was filed. The system continued. Chaplains wrote letters. Officers wrote letters. The language of these letters was calibrated over time toward a set of phrases that communicated grief without conveying information, that expressed honor without describing what had actually happened. Families received these letters and tried to read between the lines of language that had been specifically designed to have no lines between which to read. They wrote back, asking for details. Sometimes they received more carefully worded letters in return. Sometimes they did not receive replies at all, because the officer who had written the original letter had himself since been killed, and the chain of correspondence disappeared into the administrative machinery of a war that was consuming people faster than any system could track them. The 11th reality was the specific experience of no man's land. The ground between the opposing trenches was called no man's land because it belonged to no one and was contested by everyone, and it was the most dangerous place on the Western Front, exposed to fire from both sides and providing no cover of any kind in most sectors. Men entered no man's land at night on patrol, small groups of soldiers moving without lights through a landscape of shell craters and barbed wire, sometimes within feet of German patrol groups doing the same thing, occasionally making contact that was brief and violent and left men dead on ground that neither side would then be able to recover them from. The bodies of men killed in no man's land stayed where they fell unless a subsequent patrol was specifically tasked with recovery, which was not always possible and not always prioritized. Men on patrol could find themselves crawling past the decomposing remains of men from their own unit who had died in previous engagements. They navigated by these remains. They noted their locations in patrol reports as landmarks. The silence of no man's land at night was a specific kind of silence, not the absence of sound, but the compression of awareness into a hyper-focused attention to every sound, every movement, every change in the texture of the darkness. Men learned to move without sound, to breathe without sound, to communicate through touch and gesture rather than voice. The training for this did not exist in any formal sense. Men learned it by surviving the first few patrols and then applying what they had learned to the next ones. The men who did not survive the first few patrols did not contribute to this knowledge base. Natural selection in the most immediate possible sense determined who became skilled at moving through no man's land and who did not. The 12th reality was the relationship between officers and enlisted men at the front, which was not the relationship that the official narrative of either side preferred to describe. The class structure of the British Army in World War I was explicit and institutionalized. Officers were predominantly drawn from the educated middle and upper classes. Enlisted men were predominantly working class. The differences in their material conditions at the front were significant. Officers had separate dugouts with more space and more furnishing. They ate different food. They did not perform the manual labor of trench maintenance. They received better medical attention when wounded. They were addressed by rank and treated, within the military hierarchy, as social superiors in ways that reflected British civilian class structure with remarkable fidelity, even in conditions of shared mortal danger. This is not to say that officers and enlisted men did not develop genuine bonds of mutual regard. They did, frequently, and the literature of the war is full of accounts of officers who were deeply respected and enlisted men who were deeply valued by the officers who led them. But the institutional structure was not sentiment. Officers who led their men well did so within a framework that treated those men as fundamentally subordinate, as units of capability to be deployed and expended according to operational need, and the best officers operated within that framework while maintaining a human connection that the framework did not require or fully account for. The worst officers operated within the framework without the human connection, and the men under their command noticed, and the effects on morale and performance and willingness to take the specific risks that trench warfare required were measurable even if they were not measured. The 13th reality was the specific experience of returning home on leave and finding that civilian life had become incomprehensible. Men at the front received periodic leave, typically 10 days every few months, and they returned to a Britain that was engaged in the war at a level of removal from the actual experience of combat that created a divide of communication so complete that many men stopped trying to bridge it. They sat at dinner tables with their families and answered questions about the war with short, deflecting answers that redirected the conversation toward topics that did not require them to describe what they were living in. They listened to civilians, including civilians in positions of political authority and social influence, express views about the war that were based entirely on official narratives and newspaper accounts and bore no relationship to the reality that the men had been living inside for months. They read newspaper descriptions of their own battles that bore no relationship to what those battles had felt like from inside the trench. Some men felt contempt. Some felt a detachment so complete that it was effectively grief, because they recognized that the gap between their experience and civilian understanding was not closable through any conversation they were capable of having. Some felt nothing in particular, because the emotional range that civilian life expected of them had been recalibrated by the front to a narrower and more functional set of responses. They ate proper meals and slept in proper beds and bathed in hot water and wore civilian clothes and went for walks in streets where shells were not falling. And all of this should have been relief, and sometimes it was, but underneath the relief was the knowledge that in 10 days they would return to the front. And the front did not change, and the leave did not prepare them for the return in any way that mattered. It only made the return more clearly defined against the contrast of what had been briefly available. The 14th reality was the specific nature of going over the top. An assault meant climbing out of the trench, above the protection of the parapet, into ground that was entirely exposed to enemy fire, and walking or running toward the enemy position while artillery fired from both sides and machine guns, which had been designed specifically to kill large numbers of men in open ground efficiently, operated at the ranges for which they had been designed. The men who went over the top knew what machine guns could do. They had seen it. Many of them had seen it done to the men they were about to follow out of the trench. The officers who ordered them over the top also knew. Everyone knew. The orders were given. The whistles blew. The men climbed out. The psychology of this act, of the moment of climbing over the parapet in full knowledge of what was on the other side of it, is something that military historians have returned to repeatedly without fully resolving. The accounts that survive suggest that the moment of going over was in some ways less terrible than the waiting. The waiting, which could last for hours during a preparatory bombardment, was the period of pure anticipatory terror, with no outlet and no action available. The moment of going over at least produced movement, directed energy, a transition from waiting to doing that the nervous system experienced as a kind of relief, even when the doing in question was walking into machine gun fire. Men reported feeling calm after the whistle blew. Some reported feeling nothing. Some reported a dissociative state in which they watched themselves move across no man's land as though from outside their own bodies. The accounts are varied enough that no single psychological description fits all of them. But the dissociation theme is common enough to be significant. What was consistent across accounts was what came after, if they survived. The return to the trench, carrying the wounded under fire, accounting for the men who had not returned, writing or giving the verbal reports that would become the official record of what had just occurred. Men who had just watched their friends die beside them sat down and provided tactical assessments of ground, gained or lost. They reported enemy positions and estimated enemy casualties. They described their own casualties with a precision that the emotional state in which they were providing that information might have been expected to undermine, but did not, because the training had specifically prepared them to provide that information regardless of emotional state. And the training had worked, because that is what training is for. The 15th reality was the specific management of fear. Fear was present at the front continuously and at varying intensities, and the management of fear was a constant and largely private project for nearly every soldier who served there. The institutional response to fear was essentially zero acknowledgement of it as a legitimate experience. Courage was defined by the absence of displayed fear, or more precisely by the performance of duty in the presence of fear, which meant that the fear had to be absorbed and contained rather than expressed or addressed. Men who displayed fear in ways that affected operational performance were subject to disciplinary action. Men who displayed fear in ways that were interpreted as refusal of duty were potentially subject to court-martial and execution. The space between these outcomes and a man's actual internal experience was his alone to manage. Men managed fear through a variety of mechanisms, some recognized and some not. Humor was institutionalized in the culture of the trenches, a specific kind of dark, flat, underplaying humor that addressed danger and death through deflation rather than acknowledgement. The language of trench humor treats terrible things as minor inconveniences, describes catastrophic events in the vocabulary of mild annoyance, and maintains a consistent tone of ironic detachment that served a specific psychological function for the men who used it. This humor did not eliminate fear. It created a communicative framework in which fear could be referred to without being confessed, which preserved the social cohesion of the unit while providing some individual pressure release. It was functional. It was also exhausting to maintain, because the maintenance of ironic detachment in the face of continuous mortal threat requires ongoing cognitive effort that depletes the same resources that everything else at the front was simultaneously depleting. Alcohol played a role. The rum ration was a standard component of British frontline distribution, issued particularly before attacks, and it served a recognized morale function that the army acknowledged without examining too closely in medical terms. Men drank whatever was available beyond the ration when it was available, which was often enough that alcoholism, while not tracked as a specific frontline condition, almost certainly developed in significant numbers of men whose exposure to alcohol at the front was the first sustained heavy use of their lives. The 16th reality was the specific experience of being wounded and the medical systems that received wounded men. A wound at the front meant entering a chain of medical evacuation that began at the regimental aid post, continued through field ambulances and casualty clearing stations, and ended for serious cases at base hospitals and then at hospitals in Britain. The speed and quality of care available at each stage of this chain varied enormously, depending on the operational situation, the number of casualties being processed simultaneously, the specific nature of the wound, and factors of logistics and staffing that had nothing to do with the individual soldier's condition or need. A casualty clearing station during a major offensive received men in numbers that overwhelmed its capacity to treat them individually. Triage decisions were made that sound clean in administrative description and were brutal in their human application. Men who were assessed as unlikely to survive with the resources available were moved to areas designated for their comfort rather than their treatment, which is to say, they were left to die with whatever palliative care could be provided. Men who were assessed as having survivable wounds waited for surgery in conditions that made infection an ongoing threat. The surgical techniques of the period were effective for wounds they had been designed to address and largely inadequate for the specific injuries that high-velocity rifle rounds, artillery shell fragments, and poison gas produced. Wound infection was common. Gas gangrene, a particularly aggressive bacterial infection that spreads through muscle tissue with extraordinary speed, was a leading cause of death in men who had survived their initial wound. The treatment for gas gangrene was amputation, and the speed with which that treatment needed to be applied to be effective meant that decisions about amputation were made rapidly and sometimes preemptively in ways that resulted in limbs being removed that might have been saved under different conditions. Men who were seriously wounded multiple times and survived were returned to frontline duty when assessed as recovered. The assessment of recovery was primarily physical. A man whose wound had healed to a sufficient degree that he was judged capable of performing his military duties was returned to service regardless of any psychological state that did not present with sufficient clarity to be identifiable as a medical condition, which most psychological states, in the medical understanding of the time, did not. The 17th reality was the specific experience of the men who broke down under this pressure and the institutional response they received. Shell shock, which is the period term for what would now be understood as combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder and a range of related conditions, was estimated during the war to account for between 7 and 10% of all British officer casualties and a comparable proportion of enlisted casualties. These are conservative estimates based on official records, and official records systematically underrepresented the condition because the institutional pressure was against diagnosis. A man diagnosed with shell shock required treatment and removal from the front. A man who was not diagnosed but who showed comparable symptoms could be disciplined, returned to duty, or in extreme cases executed. The incentive structure within the military medical system pushed against diagnosis in ways that had predictable effects on diagnostic rates. The men who were diagnosed went to a variety of treatment facilities, some of which were genuinely concerned with understanding and treating the condition, and some of which were primarily concerned with returning men to service as rapidly as possible. W.H.R. Rivers at Craiglockhart War Hospital in Scotland developed approaches that bear some relationship to what would now be recognized as psychotherapeutic treatment, encouraging men to talk about their experiences rather than suppress them. An approach that was innovative and that produced results in his patients that exceeded what most other facilities achieved. His patients included Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, but Craiglockhart was not typical. Most shell shock facilities were far less sophisticated in their approach, and the fundamental institutional pressure, which was to return soldiers to duty, shaped treatment in ways that prioritized military utility over individual recovery. The 18th reality was the relationship between the men at the front and the command structure that organized their lives and deaths. The generals who ran World War I have been subject to extensive historical criticism, much of it deserved, and some of it informed by knowledge that was not available to the commanders at the time. The charge of callousness is easier to sustain than the charge of incompetence, because callousness requires only evidence of how decisions were made and documented, and the documentation is extensive. Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig's diary, entries from the Somme, from Passchendaele, from the full sweep of the war's worst engagements, reflect a mind engaged in operational planning at a level of abstraction from individual human cost that is striking even accounting for the demands of command. The numbers of dead are recorded with the same register as the numbers of shells fired or the yards of ground gained. This is not necessarily evidence of moral failure in any simple sense, because the function of high command requires precisely this kind of abstraction. The ability to make decisions about the expenditure of human lives as though they were operational variables, because if they are not managed as operational variables, they cannot be managed at all. The alternative to treating casualties as numbers in an operational calculus is not treating them as individuals, which is impossible at that scale. The alternative is paralysis, which does not end the war. But the men in the trenches did not experience the war as an operational abstraction. They experienced it as the specific physical and psychological realities this account has been describing, and the disconnect between the level at which decisions were made and the level at which their consequences were felt was a structural feature of industrial warfare at this scale that no individual commander's character could have resolved. The machine was larger than any of its operators. The machine had its own logic, its own momentum, its own requirements, and the men inside it, from private to field marshal, were subject to those requirements in ways that were not freely chosen and could not be freely refused. The 19th reality was the particular isolation of each man within his own experience. The war produced enormous social solidarity within small groups, within the section and the platoon and the company. The bonds of men who had shared the specific experiences of a specific sector over a specific period of time, and had developed the mutual knowledge and trust that such sharing produces. These bonds were real, and they were deep, and they are consistently described in veterans' accounts as the most significant relationships of their lives. But within those bonds, each man was also completely alone with whatever was happening inside him. The culture of the trenches did not permit the expression of fear or grief or despair as individual experiences. The unit's emotional tone was collective and managed, and the individual who deviated from that tone risked social exclusion from the group whose support was the primary source of his psychological survival. The men who broke down visibly were removed from the front. The men who broke down invisibly stayed. The invisibility of internal collapse was a survival skill in the social ecology of the trenches, and many men practiced it with great efficiency until they could no longer maintain it, or until the war ended, whichever came first. The 20th reality was the specific experience of the support troops, the men who were not in the front line, but who kept the front line operational, and who existed in a condition that was neither the acute danger of the front nor the safety of home. The men of the carrying parties who moved supplies through the communication trenches under intermittent shell fire every night. The men of the pioneer battalions who dug and maintained the trench systems in conditions that were dangerous and physically exhausting, and that provided none of the social or psychological structures of frontline unit cohesion. The men of the artillery who fired the guns that made the noise described earlier, who experienced the concussive effects of their own weapons over sustained periods, who developed hearing damage and neurological symptoms that were not recognized as medically significant because the men were not in the infantry, and therefore, by institutional logic, were not in danger in the way that infantry were in danger, even though artillery casualties from counter-battery fire were substantial and continuous. The men of the medical services who received and treated and sometimes watched die the products of the frontline system, who developed their own forms of psychological stress from sustained exposure to catastrophic injury and death in volumes that would have been unimaginable in civilian medical practice. These men were not counted among the war's combatant casualties in the same way that infantry were, but they were inside the same machine. And the machine did not distinguish between its components based on their roles when it processed them. The 21st reality was the specific experience of time within the war's larger duration. World War I lasted over 4 years. The men who served in it for extended periods experienced something that short-term exposure to combat stress does not produce, which is the full integration of combat conditions into what the nervous system accepts as normal. After months and years at the front, the brain's baseline had shifted. What registered as danger, what registered as safety, what registered as routine, all of these calibrations had been reset to parameters appropriate for the front, not for the civilian world that preceded it and that was supposed to follow it. The practical consequence of this for men who survived the war was that they returned to civilian life with nervous systems calibrated for a reality that no longer existed, and that had never existed anywhere outside a small geographical area in Belgium and France. The sounds of peacetime triggered responses that peacetime did not require. Backfiring engines, fireworks, sudden loud noises of any kind could and did produce acute stress responses in veterans for years and decades after the armistice. The smell of certain chemicals, the sight of certain combinations of color in the sky at dusk, the sensation of mud. All of these sensory inputs had been associated through conditioning with specific threats, and the associations did not dissolve, when the threats were removed. The veterans were not broken, or not only broken, they were adapted profoundly and thoroughly to a set of conditions that no longer applied, and the adaptation was permanent in ways that no medical intervention of the period was equipped to address. The 22nd reality was the specific fate of the soldiers who were taken prisoner. Over 7 million men were taken prisoner during World War I, and the experience of captivity varied enormously depending on which side held the prisoners, what stage of the war it was, what resources were available for prisoner maintenance, and a range of other factors that made generalizations difficult without specific evidence. What can be said is that the treatment of prisoners on both sides deteriorated as the war continued, because the conditions available to maintain prisoners were directly related to the general resource situation of the detaining power, and both major powers on the Western Front experienced resource constraints that affected their prisoner populations as well as their own soldiers. Men who were taken prisoner lost the unit cohesion that had been their primary psychological support structure. They entered an environment that was institutional in a different way than the trench system was institutional, where the rules were unfamiliar and the social structures had to be rebuilt from scratch with men who were strangers. They were removed from any agency over their situation in ways even more complete than the trench system had imposed. They did not know when the war would end or what their status would be when it did. They received mail irregularly, or not at all. They worked in many cases in conditions that were hazardous to their health. They developed, in documented numbers, a specific psychological condition that the period termed barbed wire disease, a state of mental deterioration associated with prolonged captivity that manifested as depression, irritability, concentration impairment, and a progressive loss of the motivation to engage with the available social and mental resources of the camp. The 23rd reality, the last and in some ways the most encompassing, was the specific experience of living within a war whose ending was not visible from inside it. The men at the front knew the war had started. They did not know, could not know from where they stood, when, or whether it would end. Military information was classified at the operational level and distributed to enlisted men selectively and incompletely. Rumors were constant. The reliability of rumors was low. Official communications were optimistic in ways that men with direct experience of the front recognized as unreliable. Each offensive was presented as potentially decisive. Each failed objective was explained in terms that minimized its significance. The men who had gone over the top at the Somme and watched the battle produce 60,000 British casualties on its first day alone had no mechanism for understanding that number in any context that made it comprehensible or acceptable, and the official communications were not designed to provide that context, because the context was not the kind of information that official communications were designed to transmit. The war was 4 years long. For most of those 4 years, the front line in France and Belgium moved in increments measured in yards rather than miles, and the men whose bodies were being consumed to produce those incremental movements lived within the knowledge, which was not abstract, but physical and daily, that what they were doing was producing the front's stability rather than its resolution. Holding was the primary military activity for most of the men for most of the war. Holding ground, holding a position, holding the line. The verb is static. It describes an expenditure of human capacity in the service of maintaining a condition rather than changing it. The men held the line. They held it through mud and gas and rats and lice and noise and the dead and the rain and the food and the cold and the specific bureaucratic indifference of the system that maintained them as a resource to be consumed in the service of holding. They held it until they couldn't, or until the war ended, and the war ended in November 1918 with an armistice that was not a peace treaty and did not resolve the political conditions that had produced the war, and the men who had held the line for 4 years were processed out of the military through systems that were not designed to assess the condition in which they were returning to civilian life, and they went home carrying everything the war had given them and the official casualty count. For the war was finalized at approximately 17 million dead and 23 million wounded, and those numbers were entered into the historical record and the administrative systems that maintained national memory processed them according to the frameworks that those systems were designed to apply, and the war became history, which is a different thing from experience, and the men who had lived it became veterans, which is a different thing from what they actually were, and the distance between what happened and what was recorded continued to grow as the men who could have closed that distance died one by one of old age, carrying with them the specific weight of everything that the official record had never found a category for.